The city-state of Sparta, in the waning years of the 5th century BCE, was a land of paradoxes. Disciplined yet volatile, austere yet ambitious, proud yet perpetually insecure. It was a kingdom forged in iron and silence, where boys were torn from their mothers at the age of 7 to be trained as warriors, and where women, unlike in most Greek cities, were granted a voice behind closed doors and a will strong enough to shape destinies. It was into this world, under a dusk-colored sky that seemed to eternally hover over the Eurotas Valley, that Eupolia was born, into a noble house not royal but influential, and into a role she did not yet understand would someday hold together the soul of a fractured empire. Eupolia's childhood was shaped by rhythms of restraint. The women of her family taught her to speak only when necessary, to command with presence rather than volume, and to watch without being seen. Her body was trained in running, wrestling, and javelin, but her mind was honed sharper still. She learned the histories of Leonidas and the vanished glory of Thermopylae, but she was drawn more to the lesser-known women who outlasted kings, those who raised warriors, negotiated alliances, and managed estates while their husbands vanished into war after war. It was among whispered stories and veiled illusions that Eupolia learned the art of Spartan womanhood, not as submission but as silent dominion. In her teenage years, she observed the tremors that threatened the foundations of the Spartan state. The Peloponnesian War had just sputtered to a close with Sparta's improbable victory over Athens, thanks largely to Persian gold and Lysander's cunning. But triumph bore a bitter aftertaste. The rigid Spartan order was cracking. Lysander, the admiral-turned-kingmaker, had gained power beyond what tradition allowed. The dual kingship of Sparta was under scrutiny. Gossip filled the agora about heirs born of uncertain bloodlines. It was then that Eupolia first heard the name Agesilaus. He was an enigma even in childhood stories, short, lame in one leg, quiet and strange. He was the younger son of Archidamus II, the late Eurypontid king, and half-brother to Agis II. Despite his lineage, his physical deformity had long excluded him from serious consideration for succession. Yet there was something about him that unsettled the city's expectations. He was calm in a land that prized fury, introspective where others were performative, and unshakably loyal to a code that even older Spartans had begun to compromise. Eupolia heard tales of his training in the Agoge, not for his prowess but for his endurance. He neither begged for leniency nor flaunted false strength. He simply endured, and that made him dangerous to those who relied on appearances. Their meeting was not arranged but inevitable. Both were fixtures of the noble order, present at religious festivals, games, and state ceremonies. Eupolia noted his reticence, the way he stood just slightly apart from other men, not out of arrogance but as if constantly measuring the weight of his own presence. He had a curious way of listening with his whole body, as if gathering strength not from speaking but from absorbing every fluctuation in tone and movement. It was not romantic attention that bound her to him at first, it was recognition. In a city of men who shouted to be noticed, here was one who remained still to be understood. When her family proposed the union, Eupolia did not object. It was not her place to protest. But more than that, she saw something in Agesilaus that echoed in herself. A life shaped by observation, a will hardened not in battle but in stillness. Theirs was not a courtship of poetry or passion, but of mutual calibration. A slow coming together of two people who knew that survival in Sparta required more than love. It required alliance. Their early marriage years were unremarkable to outsiders. He was still a secondary prince, and she was merely a nobleman's daughter elevated by proximity to the royal house. But behind their quiet domesticity, they were building something invisible but formidable. A fortress of understanding, a rhythm of decisions made without words. Eupolia learned that Agesilaus did not need to speak to declare his convictions. His eyes narrowed when a lie was told, and his fingers tightened when a betrayal was sensed. In turn, he trusted her to manage affairs of the household, oversee estates, and liaise with the often treacherous social world of Spartan matrons who wielded considerable influence. Their private life was marked by restraint. Public affection was frowned upon in Sparta, and even within the household, they observed the unspoken boundaries of dignity. But in the quiet moments, when he returned from training exhausted and she placed a single olive beside his bread as a gesture of triumph, there bloomed a kind of unbreakable intimacy. It was not grand. It was not mythic. But it was absolute. The first true tremor came with the death of Agesilaus II. The question of succession erupted like a dormant volcano. The presumed heir, Leotychides, son of Agis, was dogged by rumors that he was not of royal blood, that he was the bastard of Alcibiades, the infamous Athenian. Lysander, now more powerful than ever, saw his chance. He threw his weight behind Agesilaus, arguing that despite his deformity, he was of pure lineage, virtuous soul, and a pliable character. But Agesilaus was not pliable, and Eupolia knew it. She watched the political machinations with the same clinical calm she had used in assessing rival households during her youth. She knew Lysander's support was not a gift but a gambit, and she understood that if Agesilaus took the throne, he would not be merely a puppet for the admiral. He would be a disruption to every faction that had grown comfortable during the chaos. As the Gerousia debated and the Ephors weighed their options, Eupolia prepared their household for war, not of blades but of allegiance. She met with the wives of officials, hosted discreet gatherings where no decision was made aloud but alliances were forged in glances and phrasing. She did not argue. She suggested. She did not demand. She invited. In this subtle theater of influence, Eupolia was both director and ghost, present in every outcome, but never in the frame. When Agesilaus was declared king, there was no parade. There was unease. Sparta had crowned a lame man, an untested figure, and a leader who seemed more philosopher than warrior. But in the shadow of that announcement, Eupolia stood not behind him, but beside him, unseen by many, yet fundamental to the cohesion of what came next. What followed would be decades of war, of distant campaigns, of victories that would both elevate and exhaust Sparta. But in those final days before the crown touched her husband's brow, Eupolia understood what few others did. That greatness in Sparta was not measured in roar and flame, but in the ability to remain intact while everything else burned. And she was ready to burn in silence. The crown of Sparta was a circlet not of gold but of discipline, and when it was placed upon the brow of Agesilaus II, it bore the weight of centuries. The Eupontid line had survived through wars, betrayals, and shifting codes of allegiance, but never before had it yielded a king who walked with a limp. His elevation was not a coronation but a question, posed in whispers throughout the Peloponnese and in the council chambers of Sparta itself. Would a crippled king uphold the ancient spirit of Laconia, or would his rule expose the fault lines already stretching beneath the city's austere facade? Eupolia, now queen by marriage but never by ceremony, felt that question like a tremor beneath every stone path she crossed. There were no crowns in Sparta, no thrones gilded in luxury. Power did not rest on ornamentation but in the adherence to a code so strict it had turned boys into weapons and women into bulwarks. She knew her husband had not been chosen for his might. He had been selected because his legitimacy was unassailable, and because Lysander believed him to be controllable. But Eupolia knew differently. Agesilaus did not speak often, but when he did, the room grew still. His authority came not from charisma, but from the unflinching certainty of a man who had never needed to prove himself through spectacle. He issued no threats, raised no voices. Instead, he made clear that he would rule by the same measure he lived. Silent resolve. That terrified many, and it thrilled others. The Ephors, the ever-watchful guardians of Spartan balance, remained uneasy. The Gerousia split into factions, and Eupolia, moving through the court like a shadow stitched into the fabric of protocol, took her place as the quiet strategist behind the throne. Her role was never defined. Sparta allowed no queens, no consorts with legal power. But power in Sparta, as in every city that claimed virtue while courting ambition, was rarely bound by title. Eupolia became the unseen center of a court that did not recognize itself as such. While Agesilaus handled military reforms and state decrees, she attended to the subtler battles, reconciling rival noble families, managing domestic alliances, and reading every shift in the complex network of matriarchal influence that held Spartan society together behind the phalanx of spears. It was in these early years that she recognized the true danger not in foreign enemies, but in Lysander. Once a celebrated admiral, now a statesman of indomitable pride, Lysander had expected gratitude. He had expected control. After all, it was his influence that had dismantled the Athenian Empire, installed pro-Spartan oligarchies across the Aegean, and maneuvered Agesilaus onto the throne. But Agesilaus, bound by duty rather than debt, began to assert his independence. And Eupolia, seeing the fissure before it widened, moved to prepare for the reckoning. She did not confront Lysander. That was not her way. Instead, she focused on strengthening her husband's authority from within. She gathered women of prominent households, not in formal meetings, but through a cascade of domestic invitations, shared meals, and ritual observances. She ensured that their sons were favored in the Agoge, that their daughters married well, and that their husbands received recognition in civic matters. In return, she asked for nothing, only their presence at ceremonies, their silence in moments of doubt, and their subtle endorsements when tongues began to wag. When Lysander proposed that Agesilaus lead a military expedition to Asia Minor to liberate Greek cities under Persian control, Eupolia understood the move immediately. It was a trap disguised as glory. Lysander expected that he would command from the shadows while Agesilaus served as the figurehead. But her husband, ever measured, accepted the campaign with an expression that betrayed nothing and made preparations with the methodical calm of a man sharpening his own blade. Eupolia oversaw the transition in the royal household. With Agesilaus preparing to depart, she assumed greater responsibility over the domestic affairs of the city. She did not weep at his departure. That was not the Spartan way. Instead, she stood at the gates of the city as he marched out, not to say goodbye, but to signal to all who watched that Sparta did not weaken when its king left. It adapted. It endured. The campaign in Asia would prove more complicated than even Lysander anticipated. Agesilaus, once seen as a puppet, began making decisions without consulting his supposed patron. He refused Persian bribes, outmaneuvered satraps, and won over allies through restraint rather than brutality. Word reached Sparta of his victories, his discipline, and his growing legend. But Eupolia, reading between the lines of every message, knew that something darker loomed. As her husband gained acclaim, Lysander's envy festered. Deprived of influence, he began to turn factions against Agesilaus back in Sparta. Eupolia sensed the shifting wind and acted preemptively. She arranged for poets to subtly praise the king's restraint in religious hymns. She ensured that temple offerings from the royal household were visible and generous. She reminded Sparta, without ever declaring it, that their king was not only winning abroad, but maintaining the sacred codes of their ancestors. In private, she wrote to Agesilaus. Her letters were not filled with longing or sentiment. They were reports, observations, and questions designed to guide without dictating. She told him which households grew distant, which elders murmured doubts, and which allies remained firm. Their correspondence became a lifeline, a silent thread between battlefield and home, between visible authority and invisible counsel. When Agesilaus dismissed Lysander from his command and publicly rebuked his presumption, the backlash was immediate. Lysander's allies seethed, and Eupolia bore the brunt of their domestic retaliation. Invitations were rescinded. Gossip grew venomous, and yet she endured. In every ceremony, she stood in perfect composure. In every civic gathering, she remained gracious. Her silence became a shield, her poise a weapon. She was, in every sense, the mirror of her husband's stoicism, projected into the heart of Sparta itself. But even as their influence solidified, the strains of separation took their toll. Their son, Proclus, was growing into a man under the watchful eyes of trainers who saw only the name he bore, not the blood that ran through him. He struggled with discipline not for lack of effort, but for the crushing weight of expectations. Eupolia watched him with equal parts pride and dread, knowing that in Sparta, a prince was not protected. He was tested more cruelly than all others. And then, after years abroad, Agesilaus returned. There was no triumphant celebration. He disembarked like a general returning not from glory, but from the confirmation of burdens borne. He had left as a king with a mission and returned as a man marked by the complexities of command. His hair had grayed, his eyes had narrowed, but his presence remained unshaken. Eupolia did not greet him with tears. She met him in the inner courtyard of their estate, offering him a bowl of cold water and a strip of dried meat. They did not embrace. They did not speak. And yet, in that moment, everything between them was said. He had kept the empire's enemies at bay. She had kept the empire itself from unraveling. But peace, like silence, is always temporary in Sparta. What neither of them could yet see, what Eupolia would come to sense first, was that the wars abroad had only delayed the wars within. And as Sparta basked in the fading glow of its overseas victories, old resentments, neglected traditions, and domestic rivalries began to slither back into the city like smoke through a cracked temple wall. The sound of war never truly left Sparta. It only dimmed behind the hymns of ceremony or the echoes of adolescent chants in the Agoj. Even in years of supposed peace, the city was always preparing, always sharpening its iron soul against the whetstone of future conflict. So when Agesilaus announced his return to campaign, this time not for glory in Persia but to confront enemies closer to home, no one was surprised. Sparta expected its kings to fight, and Eupolia, by now practiced in the rituals of departure, did not flinch. But this time, there was no veil of novelty to soften the blow. Their son Proclus stood taller, older, and more uncertain than before. Eupolia knew that each time his father marched away, he was not only stepping into danger himself but leaving a growing void in the boy's sense of belonging. The city saw Proclus as a future warrior king, but Eupolia saw in his quiet frustration a longing for his father's presence not as a symbol, but as a man. Agesilaus marched northward to confront Thebes and other polis that had begun to chafe under Spartan dominance. The air in Greece had changed. The imperial arrogance of Sparta, once justified by its triumph over Athens, now tasted bitter to its neighbors. Revolts brewed. Alliances shifted. The battlefield was no longer Persia's distant coast. It was the crumbling facade of the Hellenic world, and Sparta stood at its center like a fortress besieged not by walls but by time itself. With her husband gone, Eupolia again stepped into the rhythm of stewardship. She oversaw the maintenance of estates, ensured grain storage remained sufficient, arranged for the seasonal sacrifices, and, perhaps most importantly, monitored the political undercurrents that flowed just beneath the surface of Spartan civility. She hosted no grand events, for such displays were unbecoming in a city that worshipped restraint. But her home became a place where women gathered to exchange more than prayers, where they spoke of their sons, their absent husbands, and the laws passed in silence that shaped their futures. Eupolia listened more than she spoke. She learned that resentment simmered not just in foreign cities but within the hearts of Spartan citizens. The promise of eternal victory had frayed into fatigue. The long campaigns, the conscription of younger and younger boys, the hoarding of tribute from subject states, these had altered the very spirit of the city. Sparta's famed equality among citizens had withered into privilege for the few and quiet desperation for the many. And yet no one dared speak of change. It was among the women, whose voices carried no legal authority, that Eupolia began to hear the truths that men denied. They spoke of sons who returned from war colder than when they left, of marriages strained by endless absence, of households barely sustained by dwindling helots. Eupolia did not attempt to inspire revolution. She knew the futility of such ambition in a society so firmly bound to tradition. But she understood that if Sparta was to endure, it would require a new kind of resilience, one not forged in battle, but in the preservation of its inner soul. She began to mentor the daughters of prominent families. not in poetry or in the idle crafts favored by Athenian women, but in practical governance. She taught them how to read body language at feasts, how to recall names and loyalties, how to listen for shifts in political tone beneath the phrasing of formal decrees. She prepared them not for influence in the agora, but for power within the only realm left open to them, the home which in Sparta was often more influential than the battlefield. Meanwhile, news from Agesilaus filtered home in fragmented bursts, victories then stalemates, campaigns extended beyond their original timelines, resources stretched thin, alliances cracked. Proclus, aching for a place in that narrative, pleaded to join his father. Eupolia denied him, not with fury, but with finality. She reminded him that being the son of a king did not grant him privilege, it demanded patience. The boy resented her for it, but she accepted his scorn as the price of his safety. Then came the winter of revolt. In the distant cities of Boeotia, alliances formed that no longer feared the specter of Spartan supremacy. The Thebans, emboldened by their generals and strengthened by discontent, began to assert themselves with open hostility. Sparta found itself overextended. Agesilaus sent word that he would return not in triumph, but in urgency. When he arrived, his armor dulled by weather and blood, Eupolia saw the toll that years of command had carved into his face. His back no longer straightened as it once had. His eyes, though sharp, now lingered longer on the horizon as if searching not for enemies but for the shape of time itself. He greeted her not with words but with a nod that carried all the gravity of a king too tired to feign strength. Together they assessed the state of Sparta. The treasury was depleted, the military strained. Their son now stood on the cusp of manhood, burning with questions Eupolia could no longer answer alone. The Ephors had grown bolder, asserting controls once deemed unthinkable for their office. Sparta was still feared, but it was no longer respected. And Agesilaus, for all his victories, began to realize that the soul of his city was slipping beyond his grasp. Eupolia watched as her husband wrestled with choices no general training could prepare him for. There were no maps for political decay, no phalanx for moral erosion. She offered no counsel unless asked, but her presence became his anchor. In moments of doubt, he would find her tending the altar, reading over grain tallies, or watching Proclus spar with stone-faced mentors in the training yard. Her stillness reminded him of why he fought, not for conquest but for continuity. And then, once again, he was summoned to war. This time it was a campaign in central Greece, another attempt to assert dominance, another test of resolve in a world increasingly immune to Spartan intimidation. Eupolia did not ask him to stay. She simply prepared his garments, saw to his provisions, and stood with her hand on her son's shoulder as the procession marched into the dawn. She did not weep, neither did Proclus. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and when word came that Agesilaus had been wounded, not gravely but significantly, Eupolia did not panic. She sent offerings to the gods, but she also sent messages to allies, reaffirming their commitments, reminding them of their shared fate with Sparta. She kept the machinery of the city humming, even as its engine faltered. Proclus, now nearing the age of full military service, began to understand the shape of legacy. Not through ceremony or heraldry, but through watching his mother maintain an empire of civility in the face of disintegration. He no longer resented her caution. He began to mirror it. When Agesilaus returned once more, it was not with a crown of laurels but with a limp more pronounced and a weariness that even the gods could not mask. He was aging. Sparta was aging. And Eupolia, having waited again through another season of fear, remained standing, not untouched, but unbroken. She had not gone to battle. She had not slain enemies or drawn up strategies. But in every season of absence, in every silence after departure, she had preserved the city behind the armor. She had held its breath, kept its order, and passed down its memory. She had waited, and in doing so, she had saved what little remained. When a man becomes legend in his own lifetime, those closest to him begin to disappear. Not in flesh, but in perception. They become background, scenery to the epic tale, echoes beneath the roar of accolades. Such was the fate that awaited Eupolia as Agesilaus ascended from king to myth. In the years following his return from the northern campaigns, Agesilaus was no longer simply a ruler, he was Sparta itself. To the outside world, he represented the unyielding will of the Lacedaemonians, the iron-backed discipline of a city forged in blood and principle. The bards sang of his victories, even the ones that were only partial. Foreign envoys arrived to kneel before him, seeking alliance or offering tribute. The temples held processions in his name. The Ephors, even in their attempts to restrain him, bowed to the image they themselves could not eclipse. Eupolia watched all of it unfold from the periphery, as she always had. But now, the silence was different. Before, her invisibility had been a strategy. Now it was imposed upon her. The women who once sought her counsel now spoke of Agesilaus as if he stood alone at the summit of power, untouched by mortal needs. The city whispered of his divine favor, of omens that pointed to his uniqueness, of dreams that featured his crippled foot as a sacred sign. Eupolia had no quarrel with reverence, but she knew the man beneath the myth. She had washed the dust from his shoulders, dressed his wounds, read his weariness in the lines etched deeper each year across his brow. He was not a god. He was her husband, and he was fading, piece by piece, into the marble of memory while still breathing beside her. The change was not sudden. It came like dusk, gradually shading the sky, until daylight became absence. Eupolia began to notice how her presence was no longer requested at civic events. Her name was not mentioned in dedications. At festivals, when noble families were honored for their service, it was Agesilaus alone who stood in the light. She remained seated, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. She had not forgotten how to endure, but she had not expected this loneliness. It was in the domestic sphere that her displacement became most evident. Younger women, wives of rising officers or Ephors, treated her with a mix of awe and condescension. They admired her composure, but did not seek to emulate it. They saw her silence not as wisdom, but as irrelevance. They came to her home not to learn, but to display. Children reciting poetry, sons brandishing bronze training blades, daughters adorned in modest finery. They came to be seen. And Eupolia, long skilled in observation, knew that this generation had been raised under the banner of an invincible king, not under the hardship of uncertainty. They had learned pride without patience. Proclus, now a full citizen and in the ranks of the Spartan army, had grown into a young man of discipline and dignity. Yet even he had begun to adopt the tone of one who saw his father not just as a parent, but as an icon. He spoke of strategy with a soldier's focus, of legacy with a patriot's fervor. Eupolia loved him fiercely, but she saw in his eyes the distance that fame carves between generations. He did not ask of her sacrifices. He did not question how the household remained whole during years of war. He assumed, like many others, that order was the natural state of Sparta, that it had always been. One night, after a solemn ritual honoring the Dioscuri, Eupolia returned to her chambers and found herself overcome not by sorrow, but by a strange stillness. The room was as it had always been, simple, austere, quiet, but it felt, for the first time, foreign. Not because anything had changed, but because nothing had. She realized then that she had preserved this space for a man who no longer truly returned to it. Even when Agesilaus came home, he carried with him the gravity of elsewhere. He did not speak of battles, nor ask about the affairs she managed. They shared meals, shared space, but not the closeness that had once formed the unseen core of their unity. His world had expanded beyond the city, beyond the marriage, beyond the boundaries of shared memory. Eupolia did not confront him. That was never her way. She understood that greatness demanded distance. But she also understood, perhaps better than he, what the cost of that distance would be. Sparta had raised generations of warriors, but it had forgotten how to remember its women. and in forgetting them, it had begun to lose its soul. In response, Eupolia turned inward, not in retreat, but in reinforcement. She began to record her observations, not as official chronicles, but as reflections. She did not write for the public, nor for her descendants. She wrote to remember. Names, gestures, shifts in tone during assembly meetings, patterns of change among the priestesses, fluctuations in offerings at the shrines. Her records were like threads in a loom, weaving a tapestry of a society unraveling beneath its own perfection. She also began to reach out, quietly, cautiously, to women in outer villages, those not blinded by the city's obsession with martial glory. She visited temples outside the capital, spoke with aging priestesses who remembered the older Sparta, the one that had not yet devoured itself in conquest. She asked questions. She listened. She learned. In doing so, she began to understand that the true erosion of Sparta was not from its enemies, but from within. The myth of invincibility had become its own poison. Young men no longer questioned. Young women no longer watched. The discipline that had once protected them now numbed them, and the silence that had once empowered her now isolated her. Yet Eupolia refused to succumb. She knew that the tide of time could not be halted, but it could be shaped. She began to mentor a new generation, not just noble daughters, but even helot girls whose households served the estates. She taught them not to resist the world as it was, but to see it clearly. To see behind the rituals, behind the proclamations, behind the hollow praises. She taught them to prepare. One winter, as the Eurotas froze and smoke curled endlessly from the hearths of the city, a statue of Agesilaus was erected in the outer precinct of the Temple of Apollo. It was a rare honor typically reserved for the dead. But Sparta made an exception. The sculptor had captured him mid-step, spear in hand, eyes fixed forward. Around the base, inscriptions praised his victories in Asia, his wisdom in council, his devotion to Spartan law. Eupolia went to see it alone. She stood before the stone and saw not her husband, but the image that had replaced him. The man she had married had once limped with quiet shame. The statue made no such concession. It was flawless. Eupolia smiled, not with pride, but with resignation. The man she loved was now a symbol, and symbols, by their nature, required no past, no family, no wife. She turned and walked back through the frost-bitten streets, her breath rising like prayer into the morning air. She would not weep. She would not vanish. She would remain. In the shadow of the living legend, she would continue to guard the truth no one asked for. Because when myths are carved, someone must remember the man beneath the marble. By the time the great temple bells tolled for the annual Carnea festival, signaling both tradition and remembrance, Sparta was already leaning into its own decline. The city that had once stood as a paragon of order now trembled subtly beneath the weight of its unchecked pride. The rhythms of discipline still beat through its streets, the marching feet of the agoge, the chants of boys under the lash of instruction. But behind closed doors, families whispered of shortages, of failing alliances, of sons who did not return from campaigns that were never clearly declared. Sparta still believed in its greatness, but its neighbors no longer did. That was the first sign. And Eupolia, always attuned to what was not said, heard it loudest of all. Agesilaus had become a figure too revered to challenge directly. His victories in Asia, though years behind him now, still carried political weight. Yet his insistence on unrelenting aggression, his refusal to negotiate with shifting power structures, had begun to cost Sparta dearly. The Thebans had risen again, emboldened by internal Greek resentment. Former allies now looked elsewhere for guidance. Even the once feared Spartan phalanx had begun to crack under the pressure of both exhaustion and evolution. The hoplite line was no longer invincible. In the domestic sphere, Eupolia bore witness to a different kind of unraveling. With Proclus now a young man of military standing, the household no longer needed her presence for basic order, but that did not make her obsolete. In truth, the more the state frayed at its edges, the more the center depended on her constancy. Yet even her influence had changed in texture. The women she had once trained, advised, or guided now managed their own households, each reflecting a facet of Eupolia's quiet example. Some honored her with humility. Others resented her for still occupying a place in the center while they remained in orbit. She spent more time alone now, not in withdrawal but in study. The histories she had begun to compile had become more detailed, more reflective. She did not write speeches or philosophies, those were for men. She wrote truths. She recorded not just events but moods, not just dates but what was missing between them. She charted changes in rituals, absences in offerings, fluctuations in agricultural yields. Her scrolls became a record not just of Sparta's history, but of its soul, its erosion, its silences, and its stubborn refusal to adapt. Agesilaus, meanwhile, had become restless. The city no longer fed his hunger for purpose. His advisors were either sycophants or silent. The ephors, once wary, had grown weary of resisting him outright. His body aged with defiance. He still trained, still inspected, still marched, but his decisions betrayed the increasing burden of years. He grew more impatient, more distant. Proclus, seeking approval, mimicked his father in posture and speech, but lacked the gravitas that experience alone could grant. Eupolia watched the two men of her life, one moving too fast toward the past, the other stumbling too eagerly toward a future that no longer resembled what Sparta had once stood for. Then came the rumors, distant revolts, cities no longer sending tribute, even murmurs of internal sedition. Nothing open, nothing declared, but Eupolia knew how rebellion begins. Not with swords, but with sighs, with the slow chipping away of faith. She summoned no councils, made no proclamations. Instead, she began to rebuild trust in the smallest ways. She sent messages to households on the periphery of Sparta's influence. Gifts of grain, symbolic offerings, reminders that the heart of Sparta had not forgotten them. She coordinated religious rituals that honored not just Sparta's gods, but local spirits and seasonal rites. In doing so, she reconnected the center to its limbs. Proclus, sensing the shifting winds, came to her more frequently, not as a boy in need of comfort, but as a man in search of guidance. Eupolia did not lecture. She walked with him through the olive groves, showed him how to read the health of a tree by the color of its bark, how to trace the habits of helot families by the wear on their tools. She taught him that leadership was not the shaping of war, but the shaping of peace between wars. That a king could win battles yet lose a kingdom if he failed to see its quiet corners. And then, inevitably, Sparta was called to arms again. The Persian satraps, emboldened by Sparta's waning influence, stirred rebellions. Thebes began asserting itself with open military action. Corinth shifted allegiance. The city stirred with preparation. And Agesilaus, despite his age, insisted on leading once more. The ephors protested gently, but no one dared bar a legend from his final march. Eupolia, as she had done so many times before, oversaw his departure. She dressed him not as a warrior, but as a man. No sacred symbols, no dramatics, just the garments of a citizen born to duty. As he departed, Eupolia returned to her private chambers, not with grief, but with resolve. She understood that this campaign, win or lose, would mark a turning point. If he returned, he would return diminished, and Sparta would have to find a new rhythm. If he did not, the kingdom would be forced to decide whether to follow the path he forged, or to choose a different one. In anticipation, she gathered her closest allies, not in secret meetings, but in shared labor. She helped repair temple grounds, distributed winter supplies, strengthened her bonds with helot families whose loyalty had long been overlooked. She prepared the city not for triumph, but for survival. And while the men marched, as they always had, the women waited. But this time, Eupolia did not simply wait. She planned. The victory that came was not the one they expected. Agesilaus returned from his latest campaign not with laurels, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows exhaustion rather than accomplishment. The war had been won in technical terms. Battles pushed back, insurgencies suppressed, tributes collected, but the cost had become immeasurable. The army he returned with was thinned, demoralized, and marked by a weariness deeper than physical fatigue. Even his enemies had begun to pity him. Glory, once a crown of fire, had become a burden of ash. Eupolia met him at the city gates, standing beside Proclus, both draped in ceremonial white, both composed as statues. Agesilaus descended from his chariot slower than before, favoring his left leg more than ever. He did not speak, but he reached out and touched his son's shoulder, a gesture more weighty than any speech. Eupolia caught the look in his eyes, one of gratitude perhaps, or of surrender. She could not yet tell. In the days that followed, Sparta held its processions. Rituals were performed, offerings made, oracles consulted. The people celebrated because they knew nothing else to do. It was custom, not joy. They cheered out of memory, not belief. Agesilaus attended the ceremonies with the grace of habit, but his voice no longer carried the power it once had. The ephors saw it. So did the generals. Even Proclus, for all his reverence, began to notice how the weight of legend had bowed the frame of the man he called father. Eupolia watched this quiet unraveling with a stillness sharpened by years of vigilance. She had lived through the rise. Now she prepared for the fall, not with sorrow, but with precision. She began securing the household's holdings more deliberately, forging stronger ties with peripheral estates, marrying distant family members into influential regional lines. She knew that if Sparta's center could no longer hold, it would be the outer rings that determined whether the name of Agesilaus endured. But the rot was not only political, it was spiritual. Temples once crowded now stood sparse. Sacrifices had become formulaic, unfeeling. The youth trained harder, shouted louder, but with less conviction. The Spartan ideal had become a costume worn, performed, but hollow. The glory of victory had been stretched so far it now covered wounds rather than cured them. Agesilaus II felt it. He no longer visited the training fields. He rarely spoke at council unless forced. His meals grew smaller, his evenings quieter. Eupolia found him one night sitting alone by the family hearth, staring into the embers not as a strategist, but as a man counting what had been lost. She sat beside him without speaking. There was no comfort to offer, only presence. Lysander had long since passed, once a rival in the court, then an estranged shadow and finally a cautionary tale. With his death, a part of the political machinery dissolved, and with it some of the old checks on power. Agesilaus had outlived all who doubted him, but in doing so, had inherited a loneliness no king was ever prepared for. Eupolia knew this well. She had been alone long before the city realized it. In that emptiness, she found her next purpose. Proclus was nearing a turning point, not just in age but in choice. He could follow his father's path, ride the last fumes of Sparta's fading supremacy, and risk burning with it, or he could become something else, something Spartan but forward-looking. A shepherd rather than a conqueror. Eupolia began to guide him quietly, intentionally. She introduced him to advisors known not for ambition, but for restraint. She arranged for him to oversee the reconstruction of border temples rather than accompany raiding parties. She helped him understand the true power of quiet influence. Not everyone welcomed this shift. Some accused her of softening the legacy, of leading Proclus into cowardice. But Eupolia had grown deaf to such slander. She had been accused before, of silence, of ambition, of manipulation, and yet each time Sparta had endured, because of her, whether they saw it or not. Agesilaus continued to rule, but his power became more symbolic. He would still appear in full armor, address the army on feast days, receive foreign emissaries. But it was Eupolia who negotiated behind the scenes, ensuring that supplies were secured, that tribute lines remained stable, that the domestic unrest did not reach eruption. She became a node of reason in a city ruled by ghosts. Then came the news from the north. The Thebans had grown bolder. They had defeated several Spartan forces in succession. Boeotia was no longer a resistance, it was a power. The foundations trembled. The ephors called for preemptive action. The younger commanders demanded retaliation. Proclus, now a decorated officer, was expected to lead. Agesilaus said nothing. Eupolia intervened. Quietly, personally. She did not forbid Proclus. She simply showed him a map. Not of battlegrounds, but of fields. Of harvests missed. Of routes where supply chains had failed. Of households that had sent sons for a decade and received no bodies in return. She did not speak of honor. She spoke of erosion. Of what was slipping through Sparta's fingers while its generals chased echoes of past glory. Proclus hesitated for the first time in his life. And in that hesitation, he began to understand what his father never had. That a city's strength lay not in how many enemies it could defeat, but in how many people it could keep standing when the wars ended. Agesilaus left again. Not for glory, not even for duty, but because he knew no other way to be. Eupolia watched him go with the knowledge that he would not return the same, if he returned at all. She no longer waited in fear. She waited in readiness, because the weight of glory had passed from one generation to another, and she would carry it silently until it found a bearer strong enough to hold it without breaking. The seasons passed without fanfare. The hills surrounding Sparta, once echoing with the rhythm of marching feet, fell into a hush broken only by distant horns and the wind across olive groves. It was not peace. Sparta never truly knew peace. It was something quieter, heavier, a stillness saturated with the exhaustion of a city too proud to admit its fatigue. After decades of campaign and sacrifice, the war drums had dulled to a low throb in the background, persistent, but no longer galvanizing. Agesilaus had returned from his last campaign with no heralds, no spoils, no triumphs. His eyes were deeper set than ever, his skin drawn tightly over a frame thinned by age and unrelenting travel. What he brought back was not victory, but confirmation. Sparta could no longer bend the world to its will. It could only brace itself against change, against entropy. Eupolia met him not at the gates this time, but within the walls of their household, at the edge of the private courtyard where the cypress tree they had planted decades ago now stood tall and somber. He greeted her with the nod of a man too tired to pretend otherwise. The mantle of command, once worn with iron dignity, now sagged over his shoulders like a relic of another age. He rarely spoke in council. He no longer walked the perimeter of the city as he once had, scanning for weaknesses like a shepherd guarding his flock. Instead, he sat beneath the shade of the cypress tree, eyes half closed, lips pressed into a single line, as though still contemplating battles long buried beneath memory. Eupolia did not ask him to lead, nor did she ask him to rest. She simply moved around him, maintaining what still required order. The palace grew quieter as functionaries diminished their visits, their expectations lowered by the king's dwindling presence. Proclus had assumed more responsibility in both military and civic matters, and Eupolia, with deliberate restraint, positioned herself as the axis upon which those responsibilities could turn without breaking. She no longer advised as a wife. She governed as the last voice of clarity in a city surrounded by echoes. She hosted gatherings, not formal courts, but quiet convocations of those whose loyalty had not been eroded by fear or ambition. These were not strategists, not generals, but priests, harvest foremen, educators, and matriarchs of old families. With them, Eupolia did not speak of Sparta's greatness. She spoke of its soul, what must be kept intact when all else fell. Outside the palace, the structure of the state began to thin. Ephors clashed with younger commanders who no longer felt bound to ancestral restraint. Helots, emboldened by generations of silent rebellion, grew defiant. Border towns failed to send messengers. Alliances wavered. Even the Agoge showed signs of strain. Fewer boys completed their training. Fewer families remained to send them. Eupolia saw the cracks forming in the walls, not physical but spiritual. Sparta had once been a city of simplicity and unity. Now it had become a city of ghosts. Men clung to laws they no longer understood. Women bore sons they no longer believed would return. She watched this unraveling with the gaze of someone who had prepared for it her entire life. Not because she welcomed it, but because she knew it was inevitable. Agesilaus no longer resisted his own decay. He spent his days in quiet, punctuated by occasional remarks. Half-formed, distant, like a man waking from dreams he could not remember. He spoke less to Proclus, who now led with the shadow of his father's legend pressing into his every step. The younger man, full of vigor but burdened by expectation, turned more frequently to his mother for counsel. Eupolia offered it sparingly. Her words were never commands. They were principles. Do not pursue loyalty through fear. Do not secure peace through pride. Do not forget that kings do not inherit the state. They inherit the wounds. In the temple courtyards, she reintroduced observances that had been neglected during the long years of war. She encouraged the return of seasonal festivals that honored harvests and fertility, not just victory and conquest. She supported the rebuilding of communal wells, the planting of trees in neglected quarters. These were not grand policies. They were quiet restorations of faith in daily life. And they began to take root. Proclus followed her example, not perfectly, but faithfully. He began to speak in assemblies with measured tone, invoking not just the old glories, but the responsibilities of the living. He proposed reforms modest yet symbolically significant, allowing helots more security in exchange for service, restoring rights to displaced citizens, and promoting cooperation over dominance among allied cities. Some accused him of softness, but Eupolia knew this was not weakness. It was preservation. One afternoon, while walking the perimeter of their estate, Eupolia found Agesilaus seated by the edge of the outer wall, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He did not look to her, but spoke, barely above a whisper. She stood behind him, listening. What he said was not a command, not a regret, but a single acknowledgement, that he had outlived not only his enemies, but his own vision. That the Sparta he had fought for no longer existed, not because it was defeated, but because it had changed without asking permission. She did not answer. There was nothing to say. When he fell ill weeks later, she remained by his side, not as queen, but as witness. His body weakened slowly, like a fortress eroded not by siege, but by time. Physicians came and went. Rituals were performed, but the outcome was never in doubt. Sparta would not bury a king. It would bury a legend. And legends leave behind a silence heavier than the lives they overshadowed. Eupolia made no announcements. She did not summon distant kin, nor arrange for lavish farewells. She sat beside him in the final hours, holding a candle whose flame barely flickered in the still air. He died as he had lived. In restraint, in silence, in solitude surrounded by a city he could no longer hold. Afterwards, Sparta mourned with its usual severity. Brief rites, somber hymns, declarations of succession. But beneath the surface, a new chapter had begun. One that Eupolia, more than anyone, had prepared for. She stood at the threshold of the palace, neither weeping nor stoic, just present, just enduring. The long silence between wars had not ended, but she had ensured that it would not consume what still lived. Not Sparta's memory, not its meaning, and not the man she had once called husband, now returned to dust and myth. The house grew quieter after Agesilaus died, but not in grief. The silence that followed his passing was deeper than mourning. It was a hollowing, a thinning of presence, as if something once central to the city's breath had exhaled for the final time and left the air thinner for everyone. But in that stillness Eupolia remained, upright, composed, and alone. No tomb was built in grandeur. No great monument erected. Sparta did not enshrine its heroes in marble temples. It folded them back into the earth, as it did with its laws and its dead. The memory of Agesilaus, though lingered, not just in tales of war, but in the expectations that still clung to the shoulders of his son, to the walls of the palace, and to the eyes of those who passed Eupolia in the agora without quite knowing what to say. She had been at the center of power for decades. Yet now, in the aftermath, she found herself gently erased, not by malice, but by the inertia of time. There were new leaders now, new wives, new ceremonies conducted without her oversight. Proclus had inherited the mantle, though not the myth. He bore the name of his father with a dignity that was quieter, more thoughtful, more cautious than Spartan tradition was comfortable with. But Eupolia had taught him not to chase applause, only to endure it. In her chambers, she no longer dressed in the ceremonial linen of a royal matron. She wore the deep, undyed wool of a woman who kept to the margins. Visitors came less frequently. The world moved on as it always does when legends fade. Eupolia did not resist this vanishing. She had waited her entire life, not just for her husband's return, not just for the wars to end, but for the moment when she would no longer be needed. And now that it had come, she greeted it with a calm that unsettled those who still expected greatness to be loud. She spent her mornings in the gardens she had once walked with Agesilaus in his few moments of leisure. The cypress tree they had planted together now cast a long shadow across the courtyard. There, she read from the scrolls she had written, records not of policy or conquest, but of gestures, of shifting winds, of absences. She had no desire to publish them. Their purpose was not glory, but truth. They were a map of how a civilization survives itself. At times, young women came to her, not many and never in groups. They came with questions, not about politics or governance, but about patience, about loss, about how to live in a place that no longer recognizes your name, but still depends on your silence to hold its shape. Eupolia answered only with stories, never about herself. Always about someone else who had once stood on the edge of power and watched it drift past like a boat never boarded. She no longer sat at state functions. She no longer received offerings or tokens of honor. But when Proclus returned from campaigns, it was to her he first bowed, not in ceremony, but in gratitude. He had come to understand, as only age and hardship can teach, what she had preserved in the shadows of his childhood. She had not been a queen in title, but she had ruled a kingdom no general could command. The memory of what Sparta had been before pride overtook purpose. One winter she fell ill. The physicians came with their herbs and incantations. She accepted their treatments with the same composure she had accepted victories and betrayals. Proclus sat with her in the afternoons, and together they watched the olive trees bend under the weight of the season. He asked her once what she feared. She did not answer. Instead, she traced the edge of the wool blanket across her lap and whispered a single phrase, not being forgotten, but being remembered wrongly. It was in that moment he understood why she had written everything down, not for history, but to resist distortion, to ensure that someone, somewhere, would know the truth of how Sparta had been held together not only by spears and blood, but by hands that never touched a sword. When she passed, there were no public lamentations. A small funeral, a private pyre, her ashes scattered in the grove behind the palace, where no monument marked her resting place. Only the cypress tree remained, and a silence that did not ache, but settled. Afterward, Proclus ordered her writings to be sealed, not hidden but protected. They would not become propaganda. They would wait, as she had, for the moment someone would need them, and they would speak then, as she always had, not with declarations but with presence. In the years that followed, her name faded from common speech. New generations rose, spoke of war and policy, of gods and kings. But when wise women gathered in courtyards, when sons returned home broken and mothers held the state together with food and prayer, when the future felt uncertain and the past too heavy to carry, someone would speak of her, not loudly, not often, just enough. They called her the queen who waited. But those who truly remembered knew better. She had not waited. She had endured. Long after Eupolia's ashes had mingled with the soil beneath the cypress tree, the grove remained silent. There were no statues carved in her image, no hymns composed in her honor. Her name was not inscribed on temple walls or engraved into stone records. And yet, something of her lingered, an absence too complete to be coincidence. The palace she had once walked seemed more brittle without her presence. The rooms where she had sat, where decisions were felt before they were spoken, now carried a quiet tension, as if the walls themselves missed the weight of her stillness. Sparta itself had changed irrevocably. The world around it no longer feared the phalanx, no longer bent under the pressure of its glares and decrees. The old alliances had fractured, the conquered territories drifted away, and the neighboring cities, once wary, then resentful, now simply watched. No invasions came, no great wars returned. But the silence was not peace. It was abandonment. Sparta had become the last steward of a way of life no longer desired. Proclus ruled with dignity, but without the fire of his father. His vision had been shaped not by glory but by preservation. He sought no empire. He rebuilt shrines, strengthened granaries, allowed breath where once there had only been command. His reforms were modest, his name rarely praised. He was not a legend. He was a custodian, and in this, he honored his mother more than any monument ever could. Those who had known Eupolia in her final years passed stories on, fragmented, quiet tales of her patience, her precision, her refusal to despair even as the city's heartbeat grew faint. These were not stories of battles or divine signs. They were stories of bread baked for mourning neighbors, of scrolls wrapped carefully against moisture, of moments when a single gaze from her steadied the trembling hands of a young official. No one called her queen. They called her necessary. In the outlying districts, women whispered of her in midwives' huts and under starlit porticos. She had come to mean something more than a person. She had become a pattern. When things threatened to unravel, when suns vanished across the Taygetos hills, when the crops failed and the soldiers returned with hollow eyes, they remembered her, not with wailing, but with posture, with calm, with eyes that saw beyond the moment. They wore her memory like armor, not against spears, but against forgetting who they were. The records she had left remained sealed for a generation. When they were finally unwrapped, not by decree, but by curiosity, what emerged was not a chronicle of kings or campaigns. It was a quiet archive of everything overlooked. She had documented the cycle of crops across a decade, the rising price of olive oil in a single quarter, the names of all Helot families who had worked the palace lands. She had traced festivals through their changing prayers, measured the space between rituals as time widened their intervals. Her records were not dramatic. They were devastating. Scholars would later debate what her intention had been, whether she had written to preserve, to warn, or simply to be remembered. But those who truly understood her knew the answer was none of these. Eupolia had not written for posterity. She had written because things must be seen before they vanish. Her legacy was not in shaping Sparta's politics. It was in guarding its breath while the world forgot it. In time, Sparta fell not with fire, but with erosion. It faded into the folds of larger empires, into history books, into myth. Tourists came and asked about Leonidas, about Thermopylae, about warriors who had once died rather than retreat. Few asked about the women. Fewer still asked about Eupolia. But somewhere in the dust, under the roots of a cypress older than memory, something remained. Not her body, not her words, but her silence. The silence of waiting, the silence of enduring, the silence of the last woman of Sparta. And in that silence, there was strength beyond legend. Because legends fall, but silence remains.